Welcome everybody. I'm Michael Rugel from the National Museum of American Jewish Military History, where we tell the story of Jews serving in the American military prior to the Revolutionary War up through the present. Pleased to be joined today by Howard Mansfield and Scott Mansfield. Howard is the author of I Will Tell No War Stories, What Our Fathers Left Unsaid About World War II. Scott is Howard's nephew and the grandson of Pincus Mansfield, whose World War II experiences are the subject of the book. Here at the museum, I frequently meet visitors who are the descendants of men and women who served in war, and particularly the children and grandchildren of those who served in World War II. And in talking to them, probably the single most repeated refrain I hear is, he didn't really talk about it. And that silence around the wartime experiences was a part of the post-war experience for many American families, many American Jewish families of veterans. So it was really great to see this book, which goes directly addresses that silence and how it impacts a family, and also fills that silence, replaces that silence with the stories, in this case, of what it was like to be an aerial gunner in World War II. So I will turn it over to Howard and Scott in a minute. We will get to Q&A at the end of their discussion. So please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to submit questions. Howard Mansfield sifts through the commonplace and the forgotten to discover stories that tell us about ourselves and our place in the world. He writes about history, architecture, and preservation. He is the author of a dozen books, including The Bones of the Earth, The Same Acts Twice, Chasing Eden, Dwelling in Possibilities, Searching for the Soul of Shelter, and In the Memory House, which the New York Times called a wise and beautiful book. In Mansfield's latest book, I Will Tell No War Stories, What Our Fathers Left Unsaid About World War II, he breaks through the wall of silence some war veterans maintain, said bookless. The result is an impeccably researched and beautifully written account of the stories his father wouldn't tell. Readers will find themselves in heated sheepskin flight suits and oxygen masks high in the sky over enemy territory, a vital and moving history of all that is left unsaid in the aftermath of war and how that affects the next generation. So yeah, great description for booklist. I really enjoyed the book and excited to have Howard and Scott here. So I'll turn it over to you guys and we will be back for Q&A.
Great. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Mike. It's really wonderful to join you and everybody else by Zoom. And it's great to have my nephew, Scott, here. The book is dedicated to Scott. He makes a couple of brief appearances in the book and also helped out with some research. So I thought I'd put him to work here today and have him conduct a short interview.
Yes. And thankfully, the places where I show up in the book are not during the aerial combat. But I think that rolling right out of Mike's kind of roll call of your different books, many of which focus on New England and sort of ideas that come out of living in New England and the way that people tell stories there. How did you come to write this other book that's so different and is about more things?
Yeah, that's a good question. My books usually look at the way we construct our history, the stories we tell ourselves, who we choose as ancestors and who we omit. So it's a social history. It's a history of storytelling in a way. It's a way we decide where we are. So my father, your grandfather, Pincus Mansfield, got to be about 93, I think, and he'd been living on his own with some help in the house, and he's getting to the point where he had to need more than that. So we got him into a nursing home, a VA home, as it turned out, and we started cleaning up the house. Your brother primarily, your father primarily, and myself coming down to help. And one day I opened up a drawer I'd never be in, cufflinks and things like that, and tie clasp. And there was a small set of papers folded over and lying on its side. And I picked it up, and my God, it was a diary of the missions he had flown when he was 19 and 20 in 1944. I couldn't believe it. I just stood there reading it as fast as I could, as if the ink were about to evaporate while I held it. And I knew, even as I held it, because I'd written about the strategic bombing campaign before, that this was strictly verboten. You were not at all supposed. This is a page of the diary right here, page 1, I think. Yeah, and you were not supposed to do this. They did not want you to do that. Information was at a premium in the war on both sides. So I'm turning pages, and then I come to a block of text, typed text in kind of this military language, and it was the base censor seizing the diary saying, sign here, and we will mail this back to you after the war, 1639, Monroe Avenue in the Bronx. And weirdly enough, they did. So I was just like stunned. Says, oh, I'm going to find, he never talked about his war service, and we'll get to that. And I said, you know what? I'm going to find out about this. I'm going to write for his record. What does the military do? They move people around like mad. They keep records, and occasionally they fight wars. So I wrote to the Central Archives in St. Louis and said, my father served from this date to this date. I had like his discharge papers. I'd like his service records. And they wrote back and said, God, we can't do that because in 1973 at the Central Archives, there was a massive fire that burned for days. 43 or something fire units responded, and they lost probably 85%, maybe more, of all Army and Air Force records going back to 1912 into the early 60s. Gone, just gone. And pictures of it, it's kind of a famous fire. You can find it online. Pictures of it look like it had been bombed. So, what am I going to do now? Well, I remembered for some reason the name of his pilot, the guy who flew his airplane, who lived out on the east end of Long Island from where we were, about 40 miles from us, though we never went to see him. But I remembered his name. So I found his son, who had the same name, wrote him a letter, and he said, yeah, I've got my father's logbook. So he had in there the training missions they flew, and then the missions that were missing after my father's logbook was seized. So that was something. So I knew that. I also knew like where we'd gone to gunnery school because we found when we were cleaning up the house, oddly enough, a yearbook from the Tyndall Field, which is a strange thing to have a yearbook for a gunnery school. It's just what they did. So that was helpful. And then, so I was able to match up his missions to the actual planning for the missions and the history of the missions and the number of Air Force histories. And most importantly, in the actual plan of the mission, miles and miles of microfilmed planning from the Air Force Historical Research Agency. Once you crack the code, like it's not the 8th Air Force, it's the 008AF/043, bombardment parentheses heavy. Anyway, it's crazy. But they sent it by PDFs. This was during COVID. And what you saw was the war real time. Through the night, the teletype would run from the headquarters to the wing command to the bases. How many planes we need? How many bombs? Here's the codes. Here's the weather. Here's what time we're going. Here's the formations. And then here's the radio frequency codes, all that stuff. Here's the route you have to stick to. And then coming back, what did we hit? What didn't we hit? How many bombers did we lose? How many parachutes did you see? And then the early intelligence reports on the photos that did we hit the aircraft factory? Did we not? Are we going to go back? And so you saw how improv the whole thing was, how they were trying to figure it out like mad. And it's incredible, miles and miles of this stuff. So from that, I was able to match the official record, the record of the moment as it changed, and his diary and his pilot's logbook. And I could begin to get close to what was it like to be 18, 19 years old over the skies of Germany and occupied France in a bomber. So I was able to put it together that way.
Yeah, and I think that, when I was reading it and you talked about how they have returned the journal to him, I was also kind of shocked by that. You would think they would take it and throw it in an incinerator and then never give it back.
Yeah, it was very surprising to me, and then there it was. I mean, it was a very surprising find, and it was just enough to start putting together the story. Without that, couldn't have done it. Wouldn't have known where to look.
So when you were in there in these like miles and miles of the sort of internal history of this thing, what did you find surprising about the air war?
About the airmen themselves?
Yeah, what did you find surprising about your father?
Well, a couple of things. One is that these were all kids. He was 19. His pilot was like just turned 22. And in fact, when we would grow up, there were a lot of war movies, obviously, World War II. And the one comment that was made, they were all too old because this was all fought by kids. And it was. The thing that I found surprising about my father, and this is kind of it's just kind of something that was like right in plain sight. And it took a moment or a while for it to dawn on me. Toward the end of his life, we gave him this tape recorder and he was recording these stories. You saw some of them. Sometimes he'd make up these like 1940s romance movies kind of thing, boy meets girl, but there's another guy kind of thing. But he also recorded recollections of growing up in the Bronx in New York City. And they were just like sepia tone nostalgia, you would imagine, of the Bronx. You know, they're playing stickball on the street, they're roller skating, they're building model airplanes, that kind of thing. But he's in one of the recollections, and I read right past this the first time when I was getting it transcribed and then transcribing it myself. He said, well, the other kids in one neighborhood, they moved quite a bit, would make fun of him because he had a bad hand. And I went right past it. And then all of a sudden I thought, oh my God, of course they would have made fun of him, particularly in that era. You can't see it in this picture. He was born with a birth defect, a malformed left hand. It shows up differently in different pictures throughout his life. But when I grew up with him, it was like a club. It was almost like a meaty sand club. And so he basically was like one-handed, though he didn't treat himself that way. His parents, oddly enough, didn't treat him that way. They basically, what you'd say today, was mainstreamed him. He went to school. He did everything. He became a draftsman, an engineer. He eventually became a private pilot. Nothing stopped him. So I was like, oh my gosh, this is like a defining mark of his life. And I had missed it. When we grew up, we never thought anything of it until, like, I remember one of my friends, when I was like 6, 7, said, what's wrong with your father's hand? Well, what do you mean? Because you figure whatever your parents are, you figure that's what the world is. So he was 4F, therefore, when he was called up and drafted. 1/3 of the men they called up were 4F. Obviously, he had a really bad hand. So he kept going back many times, we think, to the Air Force, and they finally took him. So why would you take a one-handed kid from the Bronx to go fight this war? Well, in 1943, when he volunteered to go fight and get in the air, the Army Air Forces was losing 75% of the men it put in the air, 75%. By the time he got there in 44, it had improved markedly. They were only losing about 1/3, 35% of the men. So each time you flew out, on average, there's a 1/3 chance you weren't coming back. There's a number of tactical reasons for this. We could talk about that later if you want. So high casualty rate. So that's why they took him. They needed to not only replace their crews, but also they had to massively expand the bomber fleet if they had a chance of winning the war. So that was very surprising to me. The casualty rate was surprising to me. The Army Air Forces, the Army Air Forces and the 8th Air Force itself lost more men than the entire Marine Corps in World War II. They had a higher casualty rate than Pacific submarine crews. No, excuse me, only Pacific submarine crews had a higher casualty rate. So I didn't know it was that lethal. I had no idea. The other thing about his volunteering is every kid was crazy about flying then. That was the celebrity technology of the era. Every boy and a lot of women, girls, they wanted to get in the air, because in the air, there's no time clocks, there's no mills, there's no family businesses, no farms. You're free. Everyone wanted to be Lindy or Amelia Earhart or a whole host of other headline heroes that we've forgotten about. There were so many of them. That was the exciting thing. And there's a great recruitment film. I think I had you watch this. Got Jimmy Stewart trying to get everybody in the air and join. And gosh, it sounds like the most exciting thing. By the time Jimmy Stewart did fly, was a bomber commander, was actually in charge of the unit my father was in right before he got there. And by the time he gets done with this recruitment film, which I'm pretty sure my father saw at the RKO Fox Crotona in the Bronx, where he always went to see movies, cowboy movies. By the time he got done, you want to volunteer. So flying was romantic. It was exciting. And in that generation, everybody wanted to do their part. So that's one of the first surprises. The other surprise being the casualty rate. I didn't know it was so high. I had no idea. And then the technology of the flying was really surprising. They're up at 25,000 feet. These planes are open to the weather. They're not pressurized cabins. It gets down 30, 40 below in there. They have these heated suits. The suits did not work very well at all. And they were constantly modifying them through the war. When he was at the gunnery window, it's like this open window right there. And he was a waist gunner. It's like in the back of the plane. Just with the winds howling through, and he had these heated gloves. He got frostbite. He was treated for that his entire life. I mean, when he's into his 90s, he would go to the doctor for, what you'd ask him about it. And of course, no medical information was forthcoming ever. It was always a big mystery. It's nothing. It's an inconvenience, that kind of thing. And I read some declassified Army Air Force reports, and there's an Army doctor Army Air Force doctor. He says, this is an aeromedical nightmare. The frostbite rate is just going to be phenomenal. You got to do something about this. This is early in the war. And indeed, frostbite was the Air Force's biggest injury. They just hadn't thought it through. Just incredible. The other thing, of course, you expect from watching the old movies, you expect the Luftwaffe diving in, shooting at the plane, that kind of thing. You expect that. But the flak, the anti-aircraft guns that the Nazis had set up on the ground, manned by about 1 million soldiers, school children, prisoners, that many, that extensive, huge numbers around oil refineries and other industries in the Ruhr Valley, really took its toll on these planes. These planes came shot up incredibly. In fact, let me just read you a short passage from a section of the book about flak.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the section I think of the most often, really, when I think about the book, because it really conveyed this incredible sense of anxiety and unpredictability that these guys were living with every day.
That's right. It was random. You could be the best pilot. You could be the most trained crewman. You could have the best prepped airplane by the mechanics on the ground, and you could be blown out of the sky like that. It was just like hit or miss. It was spooky. It really got into their minds. I'm just going to read you just a little bit of this. Flak hit the big bombers in a rain of steel pellets. It sounded like hail on a tin roof, like BBs rolling around, said the airman. It could tear into the bomber's aluminum skin with a shriek or a hissing. It could splatter the head of your pilot or miss by an inch. Loose, hot steel rattling around as if your anxieties had taken shape. It was lethal with the randomness that was cruel. They could smell the flak through their oxygen masks. Each exploding shell launched about 1,500 metal fragments. Some would pass right through the plane or explode inside, and some shells brought a rain of fire. If they were close enough to see the red center of the dark cloud, they expected to be hit. This could be what hell looks like, thought George McGovern, a B-24 pilot who flew 35 missions and was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. Quote, hell can't be any worse than that, end quote. An unnamed crewman in another battle was more direct when he said over the plane's intercom, quote, Mary, Mother of God, get me out of this, end quote. The bombers sometimes returned with hundreds of holes, with engines out or on fire, with ruptured fuel lines and cut rudder cables, with men wounded, maimed, and bleeding to death. On good missions, with meager flak and a few of the Luftwaffe's attacking, bombers and fighters could still be lost or missing in action. 7 bombers and 4 fighters on one mission, 9 bombers and 3 fighters on another good mission, as many as 93 men missing. Telegrams sent to Ada, Oklahoma, Palo Alto, California, Grand Rapids, Michigan, Hillsborough, Texas. We regret to inform you. The stories of flak are a literature of near misses, of geometry, chance, and luck. It was a universe in which an inch or two separated life and death or injury. The 8th Air Force fed quotes to the press from the pilots and the crews of the bombers. The quotes usually said, flak was everywhere, but it missed us. Flak was so thick you could walk on it. The sky was black with flak. We were shot up, but we made it back. Flak grazed my face, my legs, sliced my sleeve and glove to ribbons, but I'm okay. It ripped off my oxygen mask, just missed my Adam's apple. I can't figure out how it missed me. It tore a hole in the map I was reading, but it didn't touch me. I bent down to pull up a sock and flak smashed the windows where my head had been. I'd be dead if I hadn't ducked. Chance, fate, luck, and near misses live in the vet's stories. The pilot assigned to the squadron's coffin corner of the formation, whose position is switched at the last moment and is saved. The shards of flak twisting through the airplane cockpit, missing by an inch or less. The navigator pulled from the English Channel by an RAF rescue launch seconds before he would have drowned. Minutes, inches, banal changes that meant life or death. Back in the peacetime world, working 9 to 5, taking children to get shoes, how could the veterans explain that they were only in this life by a few inches? It was as though they'd realized, year before the physicist theories, that many universes exist side by side, the world with them and the world without them. They saw it and they had no words for it. So that is some of what impressed me. The losses just he was in a unit called the 453rd Bombardment Group, or Bomb Group, BG. They were out in East Anglia, England. It's this flat kind of ear of land that sticks out into the North Sea. So obviously closest to Germany, Holland, and all that, and flat. And by D-Day, there was an airfield every 7 or 8 miles. There were more Yanks than Englishmen in a lot of places. And he was at this place called Old Buckingham. That's where the 453rd was. Jimmy Stewart had been sent there in a couple of months just before he got there to straighten the place out, and left just after. He wouldn't have seen him anyhow. And the war took a terrible toll on Jimmy Stewart. It really stressed him out. He couldn't eat. He had maybe what we call today PTSD. He kind of really covered it up. But the losses, they're just, if you focus in on what they lost, reading the history of that. Let me just read you this other section, part of it. On November 9th, 1944, Lieutenant John Jack Friedherber's crew posed for a photo by their plane, Never Miss, one of the B-24s based at Old Buckingham. 2 days later, they were killed, shot down by anti-aircraft guns over a synthetic oil factory in Bottrop, Germany. Hit by flak just before dropping its bombs, Never Miss caught fire, the plane pitching into a dive, a wing coming off before it crashed. This was a common story. I have looked at too many photos of crews lining up like a small sports team of 10 in front of their B-24, each man searching for a pose, casual, assured, heroic, assured, hanging around, assured. Each may be thinking that this could be his last photo on Earth. It's like a yearbook in which the soon to die and the most likely to succeed are side by side. These photos grant us an eerie omniscience. There's the crew of the Lucky Penny, who you know will be killed on May 8th, 1944. They will be hit by attacking fighters. The number 3 engine will catch fire, and the fire will spread, exploding the Lucky Penny, which will crash at Feldmark Boon, Germany. There's Lieutenant Milton A. Stanchfield and his crew, standing for the charging flying bull painted on the nose of their bomber. They have only 9 days to live. There's page after page of photos. It's all too much, this procession in which youth and death are entwined, caught in some kind of random coin flipping experiment. The men of Shack Rabbit 2, Choo Choo Baby, Worry Bird, lost. And lost is the most commonly used word, as if they had just disappeared. The words killed or dead are seldom used. Lost leaves the door open. They could be down at sea, parachuting into France or Holland. Lost airmen did arise again sometimes, hidden by the French resistance, spirited through France, crossing the channel somehow, and then walking into the mess at the airfield. Back, perhaps a little strange, as they might say, and celebrated, crossing over from lost to lucky. In the yearbook-like photos, the men and their flying machines are still intact. But there are also many crash photos. B-24s nose into the earth, belly to the ground, looking like something that never could have flown. B-24s in heaps and twists of jagged metal. B-24s ablaze or turned to fire and smoke. Shamrock smashed hard into the earth in small pieces. Your eye searches for patterns. Is that a wing? Is that a tail? Part of the fuselage? Lucky, with its tail severed lying on the ground. An unnamed bomber hit by flak. A line torn through the wing as if high-flying metal termites had bored a path, or a can opener had pried the plane's skin apart. Queenie Witchcraft 2 landing with the glass shot out of the tail gunner turret and the tail gunner dead. Another landing with its nose turret blown apart beyond recognition. And another with the ball turret, the one hanging from the belly of the plane, smashed as the bomber is forced to make a wheels-up landing, sliding down the runway, killing the ball turret gunner as the waiting officers gathered could only watch. The roster of the loss in the 453rd is long. So the 453rd started operating in February 1944 with 61 bombers. By VE Day, only one of the original planes remained. The masterminds of this, sometimes called the bomber mafia, who had conceived this whole air war, which is a whole nother history, thought they would lose in the entire war maybe 300 bombers in the Air Force, the Army Air Forces. They lost 10,000. That's the scale. So it's the ferocity of World War II really comes back to you as you stick your head in it to do the research. And you think of your father, before is your father is this 19-year-old kid who, just months before had been walking around the Bronx, going to the movies, listening to the radio. It's a very hard thing to get your mind around.
So, given the form that we're in, maybe we'd be remiss if we didn't touch on your father's Jewishness and how that may have affected his perspective. I know that in the book you don't you don't think that was a primary motivation for him. He was a part of this generation that like all went to war and was all also fascinated and transfixed by flight and the place that it had at the time. But there's also this section where you talk about sort of the perils of if you had to bail out of a plane and you landed in enemy occupied territory and your dog tag said that you were Hebrew, for instance, that could be very bad business. So,
yes.
What do you think? How do you think that informed his experience?
That's a good question. So for last rites, they would stamp your dog tags, either H for Hebrew, Jewish, C for Catholic, and P for Protestant. They hadn't thought it out, so they're sending these Jewish airmen over what happens if they bail out with their parachutes. And by the way, they gave all the men parachutes and they gave them zero training. The first time you jumped out in battle, if you got out of the plane, because it'd be tremendous forces, that was the first time you'd ever jump. Some colonel, I was quoted at some place saying, when the time comes to jump, you'll find a hole a cat can't jump out of. So if you took your dog tags off, you risk being shot as a spy. So it left the airmen, it comes up many times in the histories I read, if they were Jewish, what do you do? That was a real dilemma. He said about his service, someplace, he got into a few scrapes, it was nothing. That tells us nothing. I think the anti-Semitism of his era was just like the weather. It was always there. He was called names that, you could list, but never dwelled on it. The family history, being very typical also, his parents, my grandfather, your great-grandfather, Eli and Ida came from the same shtetl that is now in Belarus, at the time was in Lithuania. He left behind a brother who for years they tried to get to come. This is such a typical story. And they sent him money to come, and he didn't come. And then one day they heard, very early in the war, when the Nazis got to the village and they created 2 ghettos, that he had eventually been killed. That's the story. That's a story that was not told in the family. But my father knew that. So he's in the Air Force about a year after they get the news that Hillel Meyerowitz had been killed. How much did that factor into his going into the Air Force? I think just a little. I think he just wanted to fly and he wanted to do his part. It's there in the background someplace. I couldn't put any precise weight on it. Do you have a different impression?
Not particularly. I mean, he certainly didn't tell me that's why he went. I mean, the more time has gone on, the more I think that, because he told me when I showed him pictures of him at 19 in the Army Air Force, he'd say, "Oh, just a stupid kid." I think the more time goes on, the more I think that he was nervous that I was thinking about joining the military, and that, he wanted to make it known that he thought that was a bad idea. That's my take on why he sort of belittled himself at that time.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. He had, in his last years, I don't know what he thought when he was in his 40s and 50s, in that part of your life when you're very busy. He definitely had remorse about it, about the whole thing. He knew why the war was fought, obviously. He knew what they were doing there, obviously. But as he said to your brother went to live in Germany and came to see him before saying goodbye. His parting words was, "Don't tell them what your grandfather did to their beautiful country." He had serious remorse about killing. And in fact, one of the few times he ever did talk about it is when you got him to talk on that little bit of video in the messy old kitchen. How did that strike you when you asked him that?
I was just trying to get him to keep talking.
I was really
trying to thread the needle. I didn't want to upset him. I didn't want to. I was just trying to keep it going. I wasn't even really processing what he was saying when he was saying it. And only after so many viewings do I get what he was thinking at the time, I think. And Unfortunately, and this will, I think, kind of leads into some of the themes of your book, but unfortunately, I asked him a little bit too much, I think, about whether he talked to people after the war and whether he talked about it after the war. And I think that by asking him about that, I reminded him that he had told himself he didn't want to talk about it.
I think that's right. Yeah. Yeah. Remarkably, so he had 5 close friends from the Bronx. He was friends with all throughout his life, and I knew them. And they all went off to war, Air Force, Army, Navy, and they all came back. And they would see each other after the war. Where were you? I was in the Pacific. Where were you? I was in this boat, this ship here. And that was it. That was it. That brief exchange. Where'd you go? I went out to the supermarket, came back. Was it that detailed? And then he knew this guy, High Pincus, who was a super salesman who suffered terribly in New Guinea. So much so that when a photo got back to his mother couldn't recognize who the heck he was. He lost so much weight from various tropical diseases and being in the sun. Anyway, they never talked about it. 50 years together a lot, never a word. And that is true of his generation. And the fascinating thing about it is why? Okay, why did they not talk? And when I've done readings for this book, there's always other children and grandchildren of these men, and they all say the same thing. They never talked about it. Never. So there's several reasons about that I think we should talk about. One is we would never understand what they went through. That was part of it. And the other part, remorse. And the other part is they did this for us so we would live in peace. You can never understand what I saw. Just go live your lives in peace. And I think that's definitely the case. They saw this silence, very contrary to the way we live today, to our therapeutic culture where we all talked about our feelings or tried to. They saw that silence. I'm not saying it's the best way to proceed psychologically, but they saw that silence as part of their service. That's what I came to conclude. There's something, there was this fellow who was 27 who was in charge of his unit for a time, Ramsey Potts, who came back to be this Washington lawyer, actually. He just died a couple of years ago. He came back. He didn't talk about the war. And then he did this oral history with Columbia. And this is what he said. It was decades after the war before I felt like I wanted to talk about it. I think the experience was so profound and the danger so great that you'd feel when talking to people who hadn't experienced it, that maybe they'll think I'm exaggerating. Maybe they'll think I'm bragging. Maybe they'll think I'm trying to make this out to be more than it really was. But the fact of the matter is that it was an extremely dangerous, hazardous task every damn day you went on one of these missions. You could even say, to some extent, you exposed to danger on the ground at your base because the Germans would try to launch some kind of attack on the bases in England, end quote. And they did early in the war attack the airfield at Buckingham, and they bombed Norwich, nearby a number of times. So that's part of it. We can't understand that. And then there's this tremendous remorse. The very last thing I found, in fact, you were there, we were cleaning up with your father, some of the last boxes that he had in storage in the storage unit. And I had just about finished writing the book. And we opened up one of these boxes, those boxes you put legal papers in, kind of thing. And there were his drafting instrument. He was a draftsman, with some very elegant instruments. I don't know if you can see that. Anyhow, there was his yearbook from James Monroe High School in the Bronx. The school paper was the Monroe Doctrine. How could it not be? And it was all signed, and there was some great signatures. One by his Uncle Sammy, who I knew, told him, fortitude, just keep staying in there. That's the key to success. And Uncle Sammy had gone from poverty to starting a super successful printing business. Real pugnacious guy, amazing guy. I wish you could have met him. And then there's 2 small tapes, microcassettes, which he'd been using his regular sets because I don't know where and when he was using these. And it turned out he had recorded these maybe about a dozen years earlier, thrown them in a drawer, and during the cleanup, they were found. And this is what they say. This is what it says. 3 years after he died, I was helping my brother sort out boxes of family photos and a few other things left from the old house. There were 2 microcassettes he had recorded a decade earlier and put away. One tape was very short, just a few minutes, His voice is serious. He speaks carefully, as if he were testifying in court. He begins, quote, October 1944. I was a staff sergeant, United States Army, part of the 8th Air Force stationed in England. I was an aerial gunner and part of the bomber crew in the B-24 Liberator bomber. We should note that on his, what was it, 19th mission, he was hit by flak, carried off the plane when they landed, and was in hospitals for 164 days. Hit a lot worse than he would have even let on. It just kind of by various hints we came across in the record. So in a handful of sentences, he talks about watching on different missions a B-17 blow up in midair, a B-24 ditch in the water with its fate unknown, and another B-24 on fire as the men jumped. He counted the parachutes. He had told a war story. It's one of the things he always says, I will tell no war story. You're not going to get any war story out of me. And even on the tapes he left, he would talk a little about the training, a little bit about being in England. And as soon as he got near the war itself, he says, and that's all the war story you're going to get out of me. But here he had told the war story. And he quickly set it aside, saying, again, and that's all the war story I'm going to tell you. But he pauses and he continues. And here, this is him talking. But now I'm going to tell you another war story. The war was over. It was probably 1957 or 58. We were home sitting there, and Mom came in and said to me and David, this is my older brother, said to me and David, a little guy, about 5 or 6 years old, Mom said, you two boys sit and watch television. I'm going to prepare supper. So I put on the TV, and little David and I are sitting and watching it. And they put on the newsreel, and on the newsreel, they showed pictures of bombers flying over the cities, dropping bombs and destroying homes. And they showed the people below. Mom came in and said to little David, she said, you see that airplane there? That's the airplane your father flew in the war. And they were watching these airplanes dropping bombs on the cities, destroying everything. And David said to me, were there little boys there like me? I didn't know how to answer that question. What do you say? It was them or me. I was part of the war and I was only following orders. How do you answer a question like that to a 5-year-old boy, 5, 6 years old? I never knew how to answer that. And to this day, I don't know. It's just something I was never able to forget. So that's how he carried the war with him. I think that's how a lot of the veterans who were up and down the block when I grew up, home from the Seabees, the Marines, the Navy, the Army, I think they all carried this war with them. They all brought the dead home with them, either the dead that they had killed or their comrades. And that's what they couldn't talk about, the dead.
Yeah, and because I think that, that's a really, really powerful story. But one of the things, I don't know if we quite touched on about why he may have felt particularly that way about being in the air war is that the aerial bombardment was not as precision as we'd like to imagine it. Oftentimes they were just hoping to get somewhere near their target. And what was near their target all the time was civilians and people just going about their lives. So
yeah, they called it precision bombing, and any historian of the air war that you read will say, no, it wasn't. We basically bludgeoned the German economy into submission. On many of his missions, they're bombing what they call railroad marshalling yards, trying to break up the railroad network, which moved arms and men around. And all these yards are in the middle of these old cities. And one of his accounts in his diary says bombs all over town. Another account of a mission, he says, bombs 10 miles short. Yeah, they hit stuff. The Air Force the Army Air Forces originally went to England saying, we're not going to be like the RAF, which was targeting civilians, trying to bomb civilians out of their home, had a policy called dehousing, was committed to starting firestorms, as they did at first in Hamburg and toward the end in Dresden and elsewhere. We're not doing that. We're not bombing civilians. And they ended up getting closer and closer to that happening. And this was the source of, in the command, in the record, you can see the commanders debating with the headquarters saying, we don't want to do that. We're going to be hitting civilians. There's even a debate with the higher command saying to them, look, you got to go do that. And they said, well, we're just going to be killing civilians directly. And he said, what if we were an army? What if we were on the ground as infantry? Would we just turn and shoot civilians? Would that be okay? So all credit to them for facing this up in the middle of the war. And we should be able to face it after the war. That was part of it. Absolutely.
And maybe just to tease out something else that I think we haven't quite touched on that sort of rounds out the picture of what's in the book and what defined his experience there too was being a young man and dating some young women while he was in the service, some of whom were Jewish, some of whom were not. And there's big parts of the book which are about that too.
Very surprising to me. He had a Jewish girlfriend. Well, I think he met at a synagogue dance either in London or Norwich. I tend to think Norwich because she was around the base and her family was around the base. And the other thing, and their name was a version of Cohen. And yet he kind of didn't realize that till he got home. But and his parents sent them a care package because the family itself, and this happened all around these air bases, the English adopted these airmen as their boys, as they call them. And they took them into the home, even though food was rationed, even though they were under bombs, and shared with them what they had. It was a really trying time. And so his parents sent them a care package, which had chocolates, nylons, a couple of other things, Lux soap, which I don't know why that, and also tea in bags. And this struck these Englishmen of the 1940s as tremendously strange. They said, tea in paper bags? Is that sanitary? I always remembered that. So he had that girlfriend who he was with. He has a tremendously, I'm not going to read this, a tremendously amazing section of a tape I discovered that he had sent to me. I hadn't gotten to it, of what it was like. He came back from a mission and they'd seen one of these planes in their formation just blown up, not maybe 100 feet from him. And he had the jitters. And the airmen would come back and they'd be debriefed or interrogated, as they said at the time. And they gave the airmen, if they wanted, a shot of whiskey. You'd have a shot. Now, he didn't drink his whole life, really, a beer now and then. But I saw him once or twice when he was very upset. Once after something with his private pilot and once a driving thing, take a shot of whiskey. It just stayed with him his whole life. So airmen would get the jitters, and he describes it was like there was his girlfriend waiting for him, and it was what a relief it was to have a hug. And they went back to like her flat, her apartment, and he just slept for 2.5 days. He had like a pass or something. And then he got back to the States. And as I say, he was in different hospitals for 164 days. And then he was in this amazing treatment place in Pawling, New York, which is up near the Hudson. And it was like a revolutionary treatment. It wasn't attached to an army base. The men can come and go. They had recreation. And he was there for a long time. And when he got better, they said, well, where do you want to go? And he said, my parents live near the Grand Concourse in the Bronx, and he's still recovering. I see you have this new Air Force, Army Air Force hospital there, and you've got men assign me there. I'll be around the corner from my folks. And he said, well, see what we can do. So they sent him to Georgia, way down the south of Georgia, 1940s. You'd think that'd be like pretty, I think in my mind, it's more foreign than going to England for a kid from New York City at the time, because the country was a series of regional economies. It was not the United States of today. And there he had a girlfriend, I'm sure a Southern Baptist, an amazing woman who makes this appearance. She kind of comes through the story like a blazing comet. She was an Air Force mechanic. She had a very specialized license to do that, to fix these airplanes. She led a band. She was like a band leader. God, what else? She had a license. She had this little car she drove. I forget the name, but she tried to, and they would pal around together, and she wanted to marry him. And I just don't know, who is this woman? She's so ahead of her time. She's willing to convert, she says. She's a Southern Baptist in the 1940s. Obviously she stayed home because she could have gone anywhere. It was so much work, and particularly someone of that talent. Know nothing about her at all. And just this last footnote about this. One time I was home, and he said, I got a call. I called up one of those wedding information, some company, and this woman with a Southern voice answered. And I just kept her on the line asking her a question because I liked hearing that accent. And it was like he was revisiting the past. It was just kind of sweet. It was just the past, the past comes calling again. And he was thinking a lot of his girlfriends right towards the end. I think he's just sorting his life out. Those were kind of being in England and being way down south in southern Georgia was pretty amazing for a kid from the streets of the Bronx, Jewish kid from the streets of the Bronx.
I mean, he had so many emotions about it because he told me that he used the word adventure to describe his service to me, and also we talked about his remorse and all those other things. So
yeah, it's exactly that mix.
Everything and more.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, obviously, running or chasing girls, as they called it in that era, was obviously part of it. And that's all these guys, they're 19, they're 20, they could be dead tomorrow. They're thinking about girls, 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 and getting out of the army. Girls, 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 and getting, as he said. It's just an honest reflection. They'd have these dances, and they would go into town. They would meet these English women. It was an amazing time in that regard, absolutely. We'll never fight a war like that again, ever. For a lot of reasons. This will never happen again. That brief window of time when that technology met the expectations and the needs of that era, that was so brief. We'll never fly back like that. It just will never happen again. Mike, do you want us to?
Yeah, we can go ahead and get to some of the questions. We can start with what I guess is a comment and question from Francine Wolf. A great descriptive writing. My dad, a dental medic in France and Germany, didn't start talking about the war until he turned 90, approximately.
Yeah.
I don't know what made him start talking. I brought him to the VA last year at 102 years old, and he was diagnosed with PTSD as his nightmares of liberating Dachau were coming back.
Oh,
he
my
still
gosh.
says that day was the worst of his life. The Jews knew what happened there. What a story. Did your dad's paper ever talk about being with the army guy? I guess that's referring to the friendship, fraternal aspect of the service, or perhaps making the distinction between Army and Air Force. I'm not sure.
Well, the Air Force started out as part of the Army
Right.
until after the war. But what was it? I'm sorry, what was the question again?
So it ends with, did your dad's papers ever talk about being with the Army guys? And I think talking about getting together with the men he served with after the war.
No, absolutely no reunions.
Developed.
They could have held a reunion in his living room. He wouldn't have gone. Just absolutely refused. In fact, when he was in the VA home, a wonderful home that was run under contract to the VA, tremendous staff to patient ratio. Everybody and all these old guys are in there. They're veteran. There's like, you see this old man in a wheelchair. He's got a hat that says Marines on the back. It says Iwo Jima. You can't imagine that this guy was ashore there and survived. The Navy guys have the names of their ships. They're all wearing these ball caps. Most of them pretty new. He was wearing a Yankees ball cap because that was, the side of his first posting. The Yankees, the Bronx, and that after he's married, they had an apartment near the stadium. They could hear them cheering. So he was very much not. He didn't want to talk about it. He said the only negative thing he said about it was, everybody here wants to talk about what you did in the war. Who cares? It's over. And he also said, he loved music. He said, all they play is military music. I don't want to hear that. And one time they took him to this minor league baseball team game or something, and it was on the scoreboard. Here are the veterans, and they stood up and cheered. And he thought this was all crazy. He totally did not talk about it at all.
David Goldstein asks, was friendly fire also a factor that caused airmen to not want to talk about their World War II experience? Come across much on friendly fire in your research?
That's a good question. I didn't. It does happen. You do see in the records of bombers dropping bombs and other bombers colliding. The plane he was in, the Mary Harriet, which is named for the mechanic who fixed their plane, which is a very clever strategy because those are the guys who keep you in the air. When they were not in, it was pretty brilliant. When they were not in it, was in a collision with some B-17s coming the other way. So it's not quite friendly fire, but they did run into each other. They did hit each other because and also kind of related to that, they had these very complicated formations they flew in. There's like the idea of almost like you're trying to build a fortress in the air and you can cover it from all angles. And they had to get up in the air in the soupy skies over England. And they had hundreds of planes up there flying around with flares, trying to find their place. Just doing that, getting into formation, before they flew across the Channel or the North Sea, just doing that, the Army Air Force lost 5% of their planes, just running into each other. These guys had no instrument flying experience. The other thing is, once they trained them, and these guys have a couple of hours, 100 hours of training. Their pilot had only 38 hours of instrument flying, which is what you needed to fly at night and in bad weather. 38 hours. Then they said, okay, they were in Colorado. Okay, you're ready to go. You've flown around for 6, 7, 8 weeks. Goodbye. Good luck. And they fly from there to Kansas, across the country. They stopped in New Hampshire, Goose Bay, Labrador, and then across the North Atlantic, flying at the speed, I think, 1/3 the speed of airliners today, on so little experience. And their crew thought they almost weren't going to make it. They started putting on parachutes before they saw Ireland, the Irish Free Republic, EIRE, spelled out in letters on the ground. So also the gunners, particularly early in the war, did hit their own planes. It was a big problem. How big, to what extent, I don't know. It's not clear in the record.
George Ferguson shared a article from Stars and Stripes about the morning reports from the National Archives soon becoming a digital resource that will be available. So that's helpful for people doing potential research like you did. I guess I'll expand that to ask if you have any, you talked a little bit about your research process. Do you got general advice for people who want to research the World War II efforts of their?
Yeah, if you know the unit and roughly where he was or she was, if they were a whack or a wave, and if they're in the Air Force, contact the Air Force Historical Research Agency, AFHRA. It'll come right up in a Google search. They're terrific people. You can search the records online. You just have to get into that military ease flow, like not the 8th Air Force, the 008 AF, that kind of thing. But once you get the knack of that, you can find a lot of records. You fill out a form. In a week or two, they'll send you PDFs, and you can sit there on your computer and crank through miles and miles of this stuff. I would recommend that. Also, there's kind of histories of each unit. There's usually somebody who sat down and written different histories. If it's the Air Force, the official Air Force history, which was published, I think, around 1960 or something, and then onward, is surprisingly frank about what didn't work and what did work. That's a good resource. I would try those things. If you have any family records, go there first, obviously.
Here's a comment from Susan Silverman. Fantastic presentation. My grandfather was the same as your father. My grandfather was a liberator, and we didn't know until his funeral. Look forward to reading your book. So, yeah, that story gets repeated over and over again about people.
It's what I hear all the time. It's I've heard some very moving stories like that.
One from Paul Wright. Did your dad do mostly daytime or nighttime bombing runs, and did he express hatred for the Nazis or Germans after the war?
Surprisingly, no hatred ever. Right, Scott? Did you ever hear him say a bad word about anything German? Anybody German? Nothing. Never.
No, and he, as you know, he talked to me explicitly about the Holocaust. He talked to me about, ostensibly he told me about finding out that the Germans had gotten to the shtetl that you described, how they killed everyone. The only thing he ever said to me about the Germans was, and when the Germans got there, they killed everyone. But he didn't follow that up with screw them or something. It was just, that was it. He never said anything negative.
Never. Oh, sorry. What was the first part of the question, Mike?
Did your dad do mostly daytime or nighttime bombing run?
Okay, here's the interesting history of this. The RAF flew at nighttime, and the Americans flew at daytime. They each thought the other was crazy. They each tried to convert the other to the way they bombed. There was a bit of rivalry and all that kinds of. So they were out there in the daylight all the time.
Here's one from Sharon Tanner. This is also a comment. I guess this sounds just like my dad's story. He was shot down over Germany and missing in action for 9 months. Wow. We even have a copy of the message sent to his parents. He was in a German prison camp. The only thing he told me as a young girl was how he loved his friends. He made sure to tell me that wherever you go in the world, look for a synagogue and the Jewish people will take care of you. And finally, he allowed me to wear his Air Force jacket and was so proud of me as I marched around the house. He only had patriotic stories to share with me.
Yeah, those camps, and you can find these stories. For most of the war, they sent the airmen off to their own camps, their own stalags. And those stories are pretty interesting, and they're pretty well documented of what the conditions were like. And then towards the end of the war, when things got really crazy and the Russians were advancing and they marched everybody out, they were very harsh stories.
Yeah. So there's a lot of fascinating stories about Jewish POWs of the Germans. So that's a whole topic that really still needs some work to be done on it. So I know there are some historians out there writing about that topic. So hopefully we'll have some programming specifically on that sometime coming soon. Sheldon Goldberg, who is our historian, and Sheldon's a veteran of the Vietnam era air war navigator. He just says more than a thank you for the book and what I learned from it. And Sheldon wrote a review of the book, which I will be happy to send to you. So that.
Oh, please do. Thank you, Sheldon. Please send that, Mike.
Yeah, a lot of these are in the more common the question category. But Robert Olesh, my father, also Jewish, was in the Army, 82nd Airborne. Didn't talk about World War II because he knew many soldiers that died. He had a photo album of the war. During weekend, he enjoyed bacon with his scrambled eggs. The Army taught him to be a dental technician, and that was his occupation for the rest of his life.
Wow.
You addressed this a little bit already, but the research question again. My father served in the Coast Guard during World War II. How can I find out about his service?
Well, find out where the Coast Guard records are. Start with the National Archives. Google around, and in a very short order, you'll find out where the records are, what records there are. The Navy, Marine, and the Marine records that were in the National Archives did not burn. So I don't know where the Coast Guard records were. It's quite possible that his service records still exist.
It's always worth making that request to the military personnel records at the National Archives, even if you're going to be.
Just throw it right out there.
Yeah.
Just throw it right out there. Absolutely.
Another one from Francine Wolf, who commented before about her dad as a liberator of Dhaka, who's still around at 103. She says, I wish my dad could read your book. Will there be an audio book? Because he can't read large print anymore at 103.
Yes, the audio book is there. Go to Audible or that giant online. Go to Amazon. It's there also. Yeah, you could download it immediately. I did the reading in the studio, so yeah, you could listen to it if he wants. Sure.
Did your dad, by any chance, mention the P-51 pilots or fighters that often accompany the bombers over France and Germany? Talk much about the other aircraft that were flying along?
Yeah, in the little friends, as the people in the bombers called it, the men in the bombers. Yeah, it's mentioned there in the diary listings. He'll list what fighter support they had, if there were P-51s or these other airplanes. The P-51s are what you wanted. They came in just about when he was there. That's one of the main reasons that the fatality rate fell. One of the main reasons the fatality rate was so high to start with was that they were convinced they could fly these bombers without any fighter support because they didn't have fighters that had the range. And it took a long time to get the P-51 sorted out with the right engine, which is this Rolls-Royce engine that the Brits had, called attention to the Americans, and that had the range. And plus getting the experience of flying in the air. That's one of the things that turned the air war around. So it is listed there when they have that kind of support, when he does see those planes.
So I'll just finish with this one. What's been the reaction of the rest of the family in getting to learn these stories essentially for the first time? And we'll have to finish up just after this question.
Well, my brother read it and really liked it. The book is dedicated to Scott. I'll let him finish up by telling us what the reaction was.
You know, it's funny. I don't know if I've said this yet, but this actually perfectly tees up my comment, which is just that since I started from the same place that you did, it was really almost the most fascinating book to me ever because I knew how little there was before you did the research. And so to see the final product was, I'm just going to overuse the word fascinating. I mean, it just, I could see, it was amazing to me how you had triangulated his experience by finding, because there wasn't that much from him. So you had to go to somebody else who had also been there, and you talked about the captain or the officer who lived on Long Island as well, who had this like full log.
Yes.
It was just incredible to see how you're able to just find exactly what had happened to Pincus just from somebody else,
And even that time when we're talking about when a plane was shot right out of their formation, right in the middle of formation, there was another pilot who was in that formation who wrote a very short memoir when he was 80s. And he was like on the other side of it. And then there was another account for someone, and you could kind of, as you say, triangulate it. There's a lot of things we don't know, a lot of things I had to kind of estimate and guess at, but you could begin to get at the experience of what it was like to be 19 in World War II, being shot out of the sky eventually.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. We did get a couple of people ask about if we're recording this, that we are recording this. The plan is to have it up on our YouTube channel. We'll send out a follow-up email to everyone who registered with information on how to purchase the book and hopefully a link to the recording. Howard, Scott, any final thoughts before we sign off?
No, thank you for having us here, Scott. Thank you for doing this. I am impressed by the research you've done about the family over in Lithuania. Scott is an amazing researcher. He's really impressed me by what he's dug out. Very impressive.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you to everybody being on. Thank you, Howard. Thank you, Scott. And we should be doing a couple more of these in August and September. So look forward to seeing everyone soon. Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.
Thank you, Michael. I'm leaving.